Okay. All right, let's get started. So, welcome. Thank you all very much for coming. I'm very excited to have Tyler Jost visiting us. Let me turn this off. What's that? Yeah. Tyler is an assistant professor of political science at Brown. His book, Bureaucracies at War, The Institutional Origins of Miscalculation, was just published last year. And this is what you're talking to us about.
Yes, this year.
This year, yes. Yeah, you're right. We're still in 2024. Tyler has published quite a bit. I view him as a leader in a renewed, resuscitated, reinvigorated group of younger scholars working on bureaucracy and foreign policy, which was pretty absent for a really long time. And there's exciting stuff going on, which we're going to hear some about today. So thanks for coming, Tyler. Take it away.
Is that on now? Okay, great. Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me, Scott, and for hosting and chairing, Jim. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm excited to be able to share with you a little bit. And in fact, I'm not sure, we haven't met them, but that's the first time I've seen a physical copy of the book in someone's possession, face-to-face, that I've not given to them.
Unsigned copy.
Yes. It's really fun. A good example of this is the Chinese invasion of Vietnam in 1979, depicted here. And we know in this war, which was not necessarily the one that comes to the forefront of mind when we think about international conflict, but was actually really consequential for Southeast Asia. This conflict originated because this individual on the left, Deng Xiaoping, who had recently consolidated power in China, wanted to, quote, teach a lesson to Vietnam. And as you will recall, in 1978, Vietnam had invaded Cambodia, launched its own invasion. And as a result, China, which had close geopolitical relations with Cambodia, wanted to exploit a kind of unique bargaining strategy that they had employed against India in 1962 in order to demonstrate military superiority over the Vietnamese. Is I think that's what it does. As such, doesn't achieve that different of the Deng Xiaoping's vision, namely demonstrated strength over. And as such, going forward, that bargaining advantage that they had hoped for vis-a-vis Hanoi doesn't materialize, such that Vietnam stays in Cambodia for nearly a decade subsequent to that. This is not the first time that leaders have charged headfirst into conflicts that ended up much differently from the way that they had anticipated. So for example, we have the 1999 Kargil War, in which the individual here on the left, Pakistani Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, gives a kind of green light to, and we can talk about to the extent it was a green light, to the Pakistani military, only to have to withdraw to the status quo antebellum lines in Kashmir in 1999. We can think about this in the US context as well. For example, the Vietnam War, considered by many to be the biggest miscalculation in the second half of the 20th century in American foreign policy. Again, coming through a series of assessments that are coming through in 1964-65, which turned out to be quite different from the reality by the mid 1970s. So the question that this book asks is really, it's a big one, right? So it's, why do states miscalculate? Why do they have these kind of very different expectations going into war than what war ultimately brings. There are many explanations for why states miscalculate or why things turn out differently. One of the big ones that's out there in the literature, although it is a tad dated, as Jim was talking about, stems from bureaucracy. And here the basic notion, the conventional wisdom, is that bureaucracy is a kind of pathology that degrades strategic thinking particularly in large groups. The saying goes, right, of course, that a camel is a horse designed by a committee. And so the kind of basic proposition in a lot of this literature is that the more we bring bureaucracy into decision-making, the worse outcome we're going to get. And yet there's a kind of puzzle when we look across international history. We can find lots of examples in which leaders had a quite tight integrated relationship with the bureaucracy and seem to be performing pretty well in terms of leader expectations going into conflict and the ultimate outcome. An example here, 1958 Taiwan Straits crisis, the Eisenhower administration. You might say, well, that this is a function of the fact that the United States is a democracy, for example. But even when we look in the case I'm going to show you today, the case of China, under a relatively what we would term personalist leader, Mao Zedong, we can get outcomes that look pretty similar in terms of leader assessments going into conflicts as Eisenhower in 1958. So the argument that I make in this book is that the conventional wisdom has this exactly backwards. And there's essentially two components to this argument. The central argument that bureaucratic participation actually decreases the risk of miscalculation as leaders are contemplating the road to war. The first proposition is that integrating bureaucracy into decision-making expands information search, right? So having a bureaucracy that's able to look out at the world magnifies what the leader can possibly know about it. And then critically, a key design feature associated with how the leader structures institutions regulating the way that the bureaucracy interacts with the leader can improve not just the quantity of information at the leader's disposal, but the quality as well. And this happens through what I term a diplomatic defense dialogue, pitting diplomats and defense organizations who have both very different information and very different perspectives about the world against one another, kind of forces this competition, which can improve the quality that the leaders of information leaders have access to. So putting this pithily and all together, the book argues that putting bureaucracies at war at home helps leaders to avoid miscalculation on the road to war abroad. Of course, this begs a question about, well, if this is such a great institutional design, why is it the case that leaders would ever select into anything but the two core features that you just listed? And so while I'm not going to talk about it in this presentation today, there is this other component in the book, which is about the origins of institutional design, which comes down to a basic political trade-off that I argue leaders make. Namely, institutions that deliver high-quality information on the one hand also make leaders the most vulnerable politically to punishment at the hands of bureaucratic leaders. And so leaders resolve this trade-off between efficient institutional design and political vulnerability based upon features of the domestic political environment. The more threat that leaders feel, the more likely they are to sort of trade away good advice, good information in exchange for political security. Putting these things all together, it's a sort of three-step argument in which the domestic political environment shapes institutional design, which can then shape the propensity for miscalculation. Okay, so in the presentation today, I certainly can't go through everything that's in the book. So I just want to highlight a couple of core things. The first is going to be this institutional theory of miscalculation, what I opened with. I'm going to go into that in more detail. I'm going to give an overview of the case evidence that's in the book, and then provide one illustration that has a paired comparison of decision-making under Mao Zedong in the early and mid-1960s. So let's start off with the theory. So the starting point of this book is both where I see a lot of the popular culture on how we understand national security decision-making, as well as the literature. And that is leaders who have the authority to decide between war and peace, right? And in the popular culture, right, there's a reason why this image, captured of John F. Kennedy during his time in office, captures our imagination, right? This idea that leaders are really, because the buck stops with them, they're the ones who are accountable and have the authority to make choices, it is ultimately they who are most important. And when we look at the current literature that has flourished over the last decade, there is a number of major advances that we've made in terms of understanding how what happens between the ears of those individuals who sit in the Oval Offices of the world can be really consequential. Of course, this goes back all the way to Jervis, but there's been a real interest in, say, the last 10 years or so. If we just take a sort of a sanity check on this, of course, leaders are not the only individuals who exist in government. And in fact, in American politics and comparative politics, there's a very robust literature about the politics of institutional design within states, the way that states are organized, the way that political leaders interact with other bureaucratic agents. And so the kind of motivation of this book was to try to say, how could we think systematically about the leaders which we've spent a lot of time studying and the bureaucratic organizations that surround them? How could we think about this in a principled cross-national way such that we can make systematic comparisons across time and space about what these institutional configurations are like? And so the core conceptual contribution of the book is to say, well, there's essentially these things, I call them national security institutions or bureaucratic institutions in the book, which are the formal and informal rules that regulate how leaders and bureaucrats interact. And there's lots of ways in which you could potentially structure or think about those institutional designs, but I focus on two key dimensions that I say can vary across time and space. The first is leader information search capacity, essentially leaders being able to reach down within the state and get information from it. And the second, bureaucratic access to information. If you want to think about these in sort of spatial Cartesian terms, the first dimension is sort of like a vertical information flow, whereas the second dimension is a horizontal one, although that's a little stylized. When we put these together, we can come up with different combinations, which I argue are theoretically fruitful for explaining certain patterns that we see, not just in the decision-making context, but ultimately in the quality of advice that leaders receive. And so I'm going to talk about three of these patterns, or the three of these combinations in turn, starting with the first one, open and inclusive institutions, which I label integrated. So there are two components of why I argue integrated institutions tend to perform better than institutional alternatives. The first just has to do with the expansion of the state to be able to look out and collect information about the world. Think about this perhaps in the comparative context, like James Scott's work, seeing like a state, the idea of building capacity to see within society. This is an analogous argument, but in the international sphere, thinking about the state being able to see out into the world, not just John F. Kennedy sitting alone in the Oval Office, but a large organization pushing information up to that leader. In sort of like, how would we know this in practical terms? Well, if we think about the touch points between leaders at the apex of a government and a bureaucratic organization, leaders can do a number of things to channel information that bureaucracy can collect up to them through connective tissue. Things like a National Security Council, which I don't use a picture from the United States because that's the first thing that comes to our mind. This is actually a picture taken from the National Security Council in Taiwan, taken from the archives, the Woshiguan archives in Taipei. The second component, right, of my theory, or the argument about why integrated institutions might perform better, has to do with the nature of deliberation that occurs in the second dimension, the bureaucratic access to information. In particular, I agree that it's not just enough simply to integrate a lot of individuals into a room, right? It's not just enough to expand group size. You want to include some core bureaucratic constituencies, namely, and I argue that there are sort of functional reasons why you would want this that derive naturally from the bargaining model of war. The first is ministries or organizations, bureaucracies that focus on defense matters. They could be important because they assess or experts in assessing the balance of military power, balance of capabilities. That's on the one hand. And on the other hand, diplomatic ministries, diplomatic or foreign foreign ministries. Why are they important? Well, and part of the credit here goes to my colleague, Robert Schubb at Rutgers. We know that diplomatic ministries don't just have people who look different that select into than those that select into defense organizations, but they tend to have a functional purpose within the division of labor in government that's quite different, right? So diplomats interact with other diplomats, that world leaders. They study domestic politics abroad. And if one wanted to think about this in terms of the bargaining model of war, we could think about foreign ministries or diplomatic bureaucracies as providing some information about the balance of resolve between states, right? So if defense organizations are important because you need to be able to assess military capabilities, foreign ministries, diplomatic ministries are important because you need that other information about what the other side is like, what the reservation value might be. So there's a functional reason why you want a diversity and this particular type of diversity within the institutional design. But there's another reason why this particular combination might be good. And this has to do not just with the fact that the two types of bureaucracies are looking at different parts of the world, but also they tend to attract individuals that see the world quite differently. This could, of course, be a function of the fact that the information that they see well in government, but we also know that different individuals tend to select into the military or defense organizations relative to diplomatic ones, at least within the United States. What this naturally forces is a kind of competition of perspectives, different ways of seeing the problem, which push bureaucrats to debate with one another. Leaders can, of course, leverage this such that sort of bureaucratic organizations are competing to provide the best information to the leader to outshine their competitors in the internal debate. So I'm going to compare that integrated institution, which for those two reasons I argue should perform pretty well, to two other alternatives that each of which has a different logic of why it might perform less well. And so the first is a siloed organization. So just to go back here, so this is an institution that is inclusive. So there's high or vertical information flow, but less access to information between the bureaucracies. So why might siloed perform less well? So there's essentially two theoretical reasons for this. And I'm going to use the EP3 crisis of 2001, in which you had a US reconnaissance aircraft crash into a Chinese fighter pilot off the coast of Hainan Island, and after which the Chinese government detained the American pilot as a kind of example to structure the discussion. So the decision to detain the American crew was made by Jiang Zemin, so it was a leader-level decision, but it was based in large part upon early reporting provided to him by the Chinese military, the People's Liberation Army. That information was biased in a certain way to the parochial advantage of the military. Namely, the military asserted that the United States was at fault for the crash. And the natural extension of that key bit of information, once the military had sort of won the debate there, or persuaded Jiang there, it was a natural extension to think that the United States would make bargaining concessions as the result of their responsibilities. The United States had just done something similar in 1999, in which a genuine accident in the bombing of Belgrade, the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, had yielded an official apology from the Clinton administration. Of course, this information that the PLA provided, we now know was just simply not right. It was biased. Both Chinese side internally, as well as the US side, confirmed this. But the institutional structure, particularly the fact that the military could send information straight up to the leader without being vetted or contested by other bureaucrats within the system, allowed it to win the debate early, shaped Jiang's thinking early, such that he decided to detain the crew. From a functional perspective, we can think about, had there been equal access to information across the military silo, which had direct access to Jiang, and the diplomatic or intelligence silos, it's quite possible, Chinese interlocutors report, that the intelligence apparatus, which had expertise on the affairs that could have questioned what the PLA was telling the leader, as well as the foreign ministry that was receiving signals from the US side that was contesting the PLA's version of events, could theoretically have entered into a debate had it been an integrated system as opposed to a siloed one. The last institutional combination I'll talk about is this one in the bottom right-hand corner, a fragmented one. Happy to talk about the upper right-hand corner, although I sort of argue in the book that these are both comparatively infrequent and sort of conceptually similar to a fragmented design for a variety of reasons. But so this combination is essentially when leaders design the institution to push bureaucrats out of the room. The sort of what the conventional wisdom might intuitively say would actually be good for decision making, because we're moving from group settings out of this group think land into a simple individual, eliminating the possibility that parochial bias would lead countries down the road of miscalculation. So essentially, the two components of the argument why fragmented institutions tend to perform worse run in parallel to the theoretical arguments about integrated institutions. Again, if it's just a single individual looking out at the world, you're decreasing the amount of information that they can collect on their own. And critically, this is a kind of strategic argument that I make about fragmented institutions. It's not just that they functionally limit the amount of information available to leaders, but the structuring of the design in a way that pushes bureaucrats out, sends a signal to bureaucrats about the type of information that, if they were to get access, leaders would like to receive from the bureaucracy. In short, I argue that fragmented institutions tend to create these kind of sycophantic echo chambers in which you get yes people supplying information that confirm leaders' priors to the extent that they can discern them. You might think that this is a sort of thing that's exclusive to personalist dictatorships or just dictatorships writ large. When we think about sycophants within foreign policy decision-making, we oftentimes, Saddam Hussein's inner chamber comes to mind, for example. But I argue in the book, in the chapter on the United States, that this is actually quite possible. It's quite possible that this happens within democratic systems, including institutionalized ones like the United States. So in particular, the argument I make in the case that looks at the escalation in Vietnam looks at Lyndon Johnson's decision to restructure the decision-making system, to put this group, which was known as an informal Tuesday luncheon, and essentially replaced the NSC system as its primary mechanism for making national security decisions. The Tuesday luncheon was a highly insular, highly informal, not staffed, no formal notes, at least in the early years of it, type of institution. And as a result, what happened was this sent, in direct connection to the theoretical expectation, it sent a chilling effect or a chilling signal throughout the bureaucracy that Lyndon Johnson would not tolerate dissent from individuals inside of it. So here you have a memoir, an individual, Chester Cooper, who was in charge of the Vietnam portfolio in the years 64, 65, those fateful years that the United States escalated, recalling a particular leadership style or leadership tool that Lyndon Johnson would employ in meetings that he would have, right? So in these meetings in which the Tuesday luncheon had already come to a decision about what the United States was going to do, but he would try to ratify or coordinate, build support from it, by bringing a larger group of individuals, what the NSC would normally be, into the room and going around and pointing at each individual and saying, do you agree? Do you agree? Do you agree? Do you agree? It's very rare that you in sort of primary sources get a clear counterfactual, but Cooper uses this analogy of Walter Mitty. I don't know if everyone knows the O. Henry story of Walter Mitty, but the idea is you have this sort of routine business person who has a very boring job and engages in these fantasies, which he sort of snaps in and out of over the course of his day. And Cooper describes having these Walter Mitty-like fantasies as Johnson is going around the room, thinking about how he wants to stand up and say, I do not agree with decisions like escalation in Vietnam. But when Johnson, the president, comes to Cooper, Cooper snaps out of it. As a result of the institution, the knowledge that this decision has already been made, and self-censors. One way of thinking about this phenomenon of fragmented institutions is this is a kind of institutionally dependent groupthink. What I mean by that is, Janus famously said that when you get groups together, they tend to put social pressures on individuals to conform, which can yield suboptimal decision making. But here, what's important is it's the institutional design that's pushing towards conformity, as opposed to the existence of the fact that the decision is being made in a group in the first place. Okay, so with the theory out of the way, I want to go over the case studies in the book briefly, and then give you an illustration of how this looks in the context of one of those case studies. So the book studies, or sort of has 5 empirical chapters. There's a cross-national statistical chapter that opens things up, tries to measure things, these bureaucratic institutions across the globe since the end of World War II, and run a series of statistical analyses to probe some of the hypotheses. But the crux of the empirical material is in these cases, 2 on China, 1 on India, 1 on Pakistan, and 1 on the United States during the early Cold War. And these case countries are selected in part because I wanted institutional variation within a given country, within a given regime, and where possible within a given leader. But I also wanted a sort of large sample of countries that were both major and regional powers across different regime types and different strategic cultures. Within each of these cases, focusing on the second 2 components of the theory, that is the institutional design and miscalculation, there's 2 measurements required here, right? So the first is the institutional type, and the second is institutional performance. So for institutional type, I look at 2 types of materials. The first is a sort of formal organizational structure. Think about looking at the org chart of a given country's bureaucracy at a given moment in time. But because we know that org charts often don't conform with reality, I wanted to look at actual information flows, actual deliberation patterns. And so I tried to collect data there. And I'm going to show you all of these things in a more concrete way in the Chinese case in just a second. In terms of coding institutional performance, the primary mechanism here is through a process tracing mechanism, try to identify what the leader's assessments and projections were in key crises and assess the validity of them in terms of what the other side was actually thinking at the time and whether or not the projection proved to be correct. And because leaders, of course, could make all of their decisions absent and apart from what the bureaucracy is telling, a critical second component of that process tracing is tracing where leaders' beliefs are, where leaders' beliefs are being informed from. In other words, can we see a clear flow of information from the bureaucracy up to the leader such that that's informing the way that they view the world? In each of these cases, there's also a medium man analysis in the kind of in-depth things that we need to do in order to apply the process tracing technique. One of the potentials for bias here is that we're cherry-picking cases. To ensure that's not the case, I look across all crises that the country was party to over the study period and look at relative rates of performance, right? In other words, what we look at or what we code in each crisis is whether or not they achieved their objectives. And what we're interested in is whether or not institutional type correlates with the relative rates of performance. And if states are being sort of cautious or good selectors, have a good sense of whether or not they're going to get what they want in crisis, we should see a higher clustering of successful crises in integrated institutions relative to siloed and fragmented ones. Here's an overview of where the data came from, a combination of field work in China, India, and Pakistan, as well as archival work in China, India, and the United States. All the field work in Pakistan was elite interviews, mostly at pretty senior levels too. It was one of the most interesting experiences in the course of the project because most of the interviews were at the minister level. Okay, so now let's provide an illustration of how this looks in practice. And I'm going to focus in this part of the presentation on the chapter that opens the case analysis, looking at China's decision-making in Mao's China, under Mao Zedong, so from 1949 to 1976. In terms of coding the explanatory variable here, there are, as I said before, three types of data that I'm drawing upon, which hopefully become a little bit clearer as I go through in the application. So the first is organizational records of the Central Chinese Communist Party. The second is records of the leader's daily activities, as well as a couple of techniques that allowed me to sort of look in at information flow within the state as best we could, at least with the presently available archival material. The key here is to be able to derive a coding according to the typology across time. And what I'm going to try to present to you is evidence that there is this break that occurred in the early 1960s when Mao Zedong begins thinking about his political succession, right around 1963, that shifted China from essentially an integrated institution to a fragmented one. So let me try to show you how that looks across the three buckets. So first, in terms of organizational records, here we see the Politburo, one of the central decision-making institutions or organizations for the CCP in the 1950s. We see the membership here, including not just the leader, Mao Zedong, but representatives from both the defense and diplomatic bureaucracies. So some evidence of integration on the organizational chart. When we look further on into the 1960s, we see a major readjustment of this. So in particular, this picture, which is a little granulated, apologies about that, shows a organization that Mao Zedong shifted decision-making to out of the Politburo, known as the Cultural Revolution Group, again, sort of focused on individuals outside of those key responsibilities. In terms of the employment of these organizations, we have from the records of Mao Zedong's daily activities, the utilization of these bodies. So here an example translated in the English of a meeting that occurred on March 29th, 1962, as well as an informal meeting. The first one was a meeting of the Politburo. Second, meeting of just sort of informally at Mao Zedong's pool in July 1958. What's important here is not just to note that we are able to sort of catalog what Mao Zedong is doing and who he's meeting with, but also get a sense of which of these advisors from which bureaucratic organizations participated in the discussion. We can aggregate that quantitatively over time in order to try to tease out exactly when the shift between a more integrated and fragmented design emerged. So namely, if I can draw your attention to the right-hand panel, here we have in the early years of Mao's reign, a relatively integrated design that's pulling in both diplomats and the military into the discussion. But critically, in the pre-Cultural Revolution era, and then even more so in the early Cultural Revolution, so this is 1963, starting point in 1966, starting point, a drop off in the amounts of interaction that Mao had, in particular with his diplomatic representatives. In terms of information flow, here it was difficult to do anything for the early Mao years systematically, but one of the things that I did was look at archival materials that I had collected and look at their CC line, essentially. So what you have here is a extract from a foreign ministry cable from 1962, the summer of 1962, that indicates all of the bureaucratic organizations that the cable was sent to. So think about here sort of horizontal information flow. And we have here not just the leader, the chairman of the CCP, but individuals who are associated with military, the predecessor of the MSS, the Diaotaobu, or the CID, as well as the foreign ministry. Okay, so we have our codings of institutional type. This gives us predictions based upon the theory about what we would be likely to see. Namely, and this is helpful for purposes of illustration, the institutional theory offered in the book predicts that integrated institutions should perform better, right? Should be able to avoid miscalculation a little bit better than fragmented ones. But the conventional wisdom sort of has a flipped prediction regarding what we would be likely to see. So let's talk about two crises. One that occurred in 1962, while China still had the last crisis that China still had integrated institutions. Sorry, not the last crisis, the last year that China still had integrated institutions, in comparison to one that occurred in 1969 against the Soviet Union. So in 1962, the genesis of this crisis is that in the tail end of the Great Leap Forward, the KMT leader, Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan, begins serious planning for a mainland invasion. This triggers a mainland invasion scare in Mao Zedong, from Mao Zedong, which generally is actually accurate. So the way I was able to try to deduce the fact that this is accurate is looking at archival records in Taiwan, including the diary of Chiang Kai-shek himself, in which he's talking about this as the last best chance for some sort of military action against the mainland. Where does Mao get this belief from? Well, in part, it comes from early warning from military intelligence and civilian intelligence in the Diaotaobu. And critical to the strategy that Mao Zedong eventually adopts, which is one, of course, of diplomacy, in which the United States plays a key part, is diplomatic input into the decision-making. So unlike the crisis that I'm going to show you in just a second, the foreign ministry has routine interaction, both to Mao Zedong at the leader level, as well as to other individuals at the sort of horizontal level. Why this is really important is in 1962, the mainland invasion is predicated upon what the United States response is going to be. The reason for this, of course, is that the KMT and the United States signed a mutual defense treaty between 1954 and 1955, which means that any major military action against the mainland would have to be approved by the Kennedy administration, right? So if Kennedy doesn't give the green light, at least implicitly, to Chiang Kai-shek, it's highly unlikely that they would actually go forward. The archival evidence that we have from the US side suggests that Kennedy, early on in the spring, when Chiang Kai-shek is trying to pitch this, is potentially interested. But after Mao Zedong launches the course of the diplomatic strategy, namely mobilizing the PLA in the southeastern part of the country, Kennedy gets cold feet. Of course, we remember just the year before, he has the Bay of Pigs fiasco, so is not inclined to approve anything but an absolute, something that would be absolutely certain to happen. And because the foreign ministry at this time has a relatively good functioning bureaucratic capacity, Mao is able to pull pull a signal out of the United States through a channel in Poland. If you remember, at this time, the United States and China have ambassadorial level talks in Warsaw. And so Kennedy is able to send a signal that's accurately received and sent up to Mao Zedong, which informs his decision not to escalate any further. So compare this with what happens in 1969. So as you probably know, in 1969, China and the Soviet Union come really close so in March 1969, China decides to launch a sort of preemptive attack upon the Soviet Union. And the note, similar to 1962, the logic of that initial conflict is based upon, in this case, an inaccurate perception that the Soviet Union is about to attack China. The logic here was, in the wake of the Czechoslovakia intervention in the fall of 1968, Mao Zedong was worried that Brezhnev was contemplating some sort of action to decapitate the regime in Beijing and install someone else. As best we can tell, based upon both Brezhnev's diary as well as the materials that have come out of Russia since then, there's nothing in the Russian side that would indicate that this was true prior to China's decision to lash out in March of '69. So the escalation that occurs after the initial Chinese attack in Zhenbao Island in March 1969 essentially causes the outcome that Mao Zedong is worried about. Essentially, the Soviets retaliate in kind. They escalate on the western front of China in August of the same year. And by the fall of 1969, there's real concern in Beijing that there will be an escalation to the nuclear level. Here, the information provision on the Chinese side is much different from what we observed in 1962. So there is evidence not just that the foreign ministry, which has been both purged and its capacity restricted, has minimal means to get information up to Mao Zedong. We know that Mao Zedong really didn't interact much with the foreign ministry in the months leading up to the attack at Zhenbao Island. But we also know that over the course of the summer of 1969, as the crisis is unfolding, the foreign ministry at various points expresses concern akin to Chester Cooper that provision of unbiased or unvarnished advice, unvarnished information would be considered a political error, again, as the result, arguably, of the institutional design that China had shifted to. So minimal diplomatic input into decision-making and minimal information search, as well as self-censorship. To kind of illustrate how this works in really granular, sort of drilling down into the really granular level, let's think back to the 1962 crisis. So here we had Kennedy, who I said by the late spring had decided that he was not interested in pursuing or giving the green light to Chiang Kai-shek for a mainland invasion. This individual depicted here on the right, Wang Bingnan, who was stationed out in Warsaw, receives the signal through the diplomatic channel from the United States. Here we're able to trace the report that the ministry sent up to the center. We know that it was sent up to the center based upon the CC line. And based upon Wang Bingnan's memoirs, as well as the sequencing of events, it would appear that this information played a role in Mao Zedong's reassessment of the situation in the summer of 1962. Compare this again at the granular level with things that were happening in 1969. So here, think, just so we have a clear parallel structure, of some of the signals that the United States was sending to China even before the Nixon administration came into office. So namely, and this is key because in '69, as in '62, the United States is a really critical player. In '69, China, if it was able to achieve rapprochement earlier with the United States earlier, has a kind of option to balance off the threat of Soviet attack. And indeed, in the late Johnson administration, archival evidence from the United States side suggests that signals begin to trickle out of Washington through the Warsaw channel that it is interested in redefining the relationship. This is even before Nixon comes into office, so the timing here is important. This individual, the individual who replaced Wang Bingnan in Warsaw, does pick up on this. So in his memoir materials, he talks about the fact that he picked up on the hint, talked about the fact that he tried to cable this back to the center in Beijing, but talks about the fact that in here, because of the Cultural Revolution and the way in which it had restructured the decision-making apparatus in Beijing, limits the ability for that signal to reshape Mao's thinking, right? So just to summarize here, we have two cases, one pulled from an integrated period, one pulled from a fragmented period, which kind of accord with what the theory would predict. The processes in integrated institutions do seem to shape the leader's belief, whereas they do not in fragmented institutions. And this push, at least in the cases that we observe here, pushed China into a miscalculation under fragmented institutions, but not under integrated ones. Now, of course, as I said before, as I previewed, this could be sort of a function of the cases that we choose. So one way that we counteract that is looking at a broader sample. So here are all the crises that occurred that China was party to from 1949 to Mao's death in 1976. And it's worth emphasizing here, integrated institutions, as we would expect with any probabilistic outcome, are not perfect, right? So we see China in 1954 as the result of the miscalculation, arguably, failing to deter a treaty between the United States and Taiwan in the first Taiwan Straits crisis. However, when we look after China shifts to fragmented institutions, a number of instances with greater frequency that actually continue in the subsequent chapter after Mao's death, a lower rate of getting what it wants in crisis. And as I mentioned before, the cross-national analysis that opens up the book tries to replicate this at a much larger scale, looking at all the crises that occurred across the globe from 1949 to 2012. Oh, and I sort of skipped the middle step, which is sort of this is an overview of the other cases or comparisons in other countries under particular regime types. Okay, so in conclusion, this book is about sort of contesting or revising the conventional wisdom on bureaucracy. The first, this idea that miscalculation stems from pushing bureaucrats out rather than bringing them in. And second, the logic that I opened up with, but I didn't have time to go into, this idea that leaders choose to keep bureaucrats out in part because of short-term political gain. Because this is a kind of more policy-relevant audience, I decided, rather than talking about implications for the literature, implications for policy, of which I think there are at least three. The first has to do with effective organization for countries trying to manage or design their institutions themselves. But the second is a kind of, as we observe, where states go in their institutional design, a kind of healthy understanding about whether or not it's going to be possible to achieve something resembling an integrated system. Namely, when we observe domestic political constraints, we would not expect the most efficient process to emerge. Now, lastly is, as we think about this from the perspective of, say, the United States looking out at decision-making processes in other countries, we want to move away from, I think this literature, this book would push us on this, move away from what Jervis termed in Perception and Misperception as this kind of centralization bias. Namely, the idea that we tend to assume that other countries, particularly those that are adversaries, are more centralized, have more control of the bureaucratic structure than they actually do. Now, it's a kind of empirical question that hasn't really been taken up as much as I think it should about whether that bias actually exists. But if Jervis is right, then what the scholarship would suggest is that there are many instances, perhaps identifiable, but perhaps not, that states do not have the same level of centralization as we often assume, which we would want to cognitively check for as we make assessments about the ways that those countries will act. So thanks so much for your time today. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A.
Terrific. Thank you very much. So I believe we start with CSAC fellows.
Whatever you want.
Okay, yeah, let's do that. Please, if you remember, if you could say who you are and what you're doing here. So sure, let's start there.
My name is
Chongwook, is that right?
Ju, CHANGWOKJU. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at CSAC. And I thank you for your talk, and I really appreciated how you explain your theory travels across different regime types. And I wonder what role, so like, I wonder in your framework, if you perceive whether opposing parties, mostly in democracies, leads to more bureaucratic deliberation or less. And I also wonder, in more kind of recent contemporary settings, how you conceive the implications of free media and free press and media in shaping leader perceptions and bureaucratic deliberation as well. Thank you.
What are the norms? Do we collect multiple?
We got time, so why don't you?
Sure.
Yeah.
So the first question is about opposition parties, right? Whether or not the presence of an opposition party would necessarily lead to bureaucratic threat. So not necessarily, right? If the bureaucracy has, if there are strong rules and norms set up that the bureaucracy doesn't have a political affiliation with one party or the other, we wouldn't expect the existence of an opposition party in and of itself to generate the types of bureaucratic threats that leaders would begin to worry about. But it is certainly true that particularly within cabinets in which you have to form a coalition, the presence of an opposition party within a cabinet structure can create a kind of situation that is, at least according to the theory's logic, suboptimal. Why is that? Well, if you have to appoint a member of the opposition party to the portfolio of the foreign minister or the defense minister, then any deliberations that you have with them have to be kind of the strategic game in which you're weighing how much do you disclose with them in order to fully assess the information, the situation at hand, against the chance that if you share this information with them, they might leak it in ways that will politically punish you. So it's not something I go into it a great deal in the book, but it's definitely there. In terms of free media, I'm not sure I totally understood your question. Was it that the erosion of free media would somehow push countries to one institutional type or another, or did you mean something different?
I just simply meant the information sharing. So your theory.
I see. So in other words, could you supplement the sharing of classified information in government with unclassified information over Twitter, essentially? Yeah, it's something I can't. It's an interesting hypothesis. I can't directly disprove it because none of the cases go beyond the early 2000s. But my strong suspicion is no, right? But it in part depends on how much you think information that is generated and kept within the confines of a government matter relative to information that is just out there in the free media. I tend to think that former category of information is quite important to the way the decision-making proceeds. But you could tell a story in which like all you need is the New York Times, and then I suppose the critique would hold.
Fahd and then John.
Hi.
Hi, Fahd.
Hi.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. I'm Fahd. I'm a visiting scholar here at CSAC this year. Congrats on getting the book out. That's very exciting. So one question that I have is, to what extent does leader personality sort of correlate with the story that you're telling here? Because I might imagine that certain kinds of personalities, more neurotic, more sort of insecure, might lend themselves towards trying to sort of configure the bureaucracy in a certain way. And then relatedly, I wonder whether one thing that I'm curious about is the extent to which this is a story about leader agency versus bureaucratic agency. Are there cases when bureaucrats try and sort of deliberately control the amount of information that is making its way back up to the leader?
So these are both great questions. So the first on leader personality, it's important to note, and it doesn't feature central in the presentation because I'm focused on the latter stages of it, right? But in the discussion of origins of institutional design, the prevailing wisdom, well, there's really two, actually. There's a kind of, it never changes. Like this is the organizational birthmarks that you set an institution up and it just path dependence all the way. I try to show that's not true. But you asked about leader personality, which is the other, if not even more prominent factor emphasized in the existing literature on institutional design, or like sort of organizational design. Mac Dessler has this wonderful quote from a World Politics article he wrote in sometime in the 1970s. Don't quote me on the date, I think 1972. No, sorry, that's his book. In any case, it's in the 1970s, in which he says that organizational design is a chameleon of leader personality. What does that mean? He means that as soon as you change the leader, the organizational design will follow, right? Which is a kind of personality argument. Peg Herman has made this argument. Thomas Preston has made this argument. A lot of the foreign policy analysis is sort of the dominant trend. I tried to show empirically that that is probably true, right? It would be too bold a statement to say that leadership style or leader personality doesn't shape the way that leaders interact with individuals around them. Like that just doesn't accord with like everyday interaction. Go to a faculty meeting, you'll see that, right? But what it does show, the empirical analysis cross-nationally, is that these institutions do change, even under the same leader, and oftentimes stay the same across leaders, right? So it's not really the chameleon story that Dessler posited it might have been. The interesting thing to me is the way in which you talked about sort of narcissism as one of the personality traits that could trigger something like fragmented institutions. I think this is a really interesting way to rethink the telling of the Johnson story. So both in the historiography of it, say Fred Logevall's Choosing War, as well as the foreign policy analysis literature that have looked at the case of Johnson, it is all about the fact that I'm not sure if they focus particularly on Johnson's narcissism, but aspects of his personality that made him prone to see threats from people who surrounded them. What's interesting to me when I look at the evidence, of course I see that there. There's some elements of that when he's in Congress, for example, but it's really pronounced, and other people notice it too once he gets into the White House. So it's not purely a function of disposition, it's also a function of the political environment in a White House filled with advisors who he had not appointed himself. And Doris Kearns Goodwin tells us, felt he had to keep on to keep the line to Kennedy alive, right? So the reason why Rusk, McNamara, and Bundy remain is not because he's in love with the foreign policy elite in the East Coast. He feels he needs to do so in order to maintain his legitimacy because he is, quote, a naked man, according to, that's naked in a sort of proverbial sense, a naked man in the wake of the assassination. So what does this do? The interesting thing to me is that it causes us to sort of rethink the way in which personality might express itself in institutional design. By that I mean individuals who are dispositionally or psychologically prone to paranoia or narcissism would be prone to see the types of threats that I think matter and are really central in these decisions. What's all the more interesting in the case of Johnson in his subsequent recollections of why he established the Tuesday luncheon, he doesn't, and of course it's difficult to assess your own personality, but he points to politics. In his interviews with Doris Kearns Goodwin, he says, the reason why I chose to hive off decision-making into the Tuesday luncheon was because every time I held an NSC meeting, it would leak out into the press. This gets back to the question of free press and the threat that it can potentially pose, or how I thought your original question was framed. So Johnson was thinking politically, I think, or at least had ample reason to think that way. Sorry, that was a long answer to just your first question. I'll try to do the second one much more quickly. Leader agency versus bureaucratic agency. Yes, absolutely. So as it was the case in the EP3 incident in 2001, the military bureaucracy didn't just have a different set of information, didn't just have a different perspective that biased the information that fed up to it. It also had a parochial incentive to lie, right? The point of an integrated institution, or the logic of competitive dialogue between defense and diplomatic ministries, is to try to force debate that would reduce the likelihood that you're going to think you can lie and get away with it. Because if the military knew that the MSS was going to be checking its information at every turn, perhaps it would have selected out of that very pernicious bias that it introduced into the data. Apologies again, that was such a long response.
No, it says, sorry.
Sorry, hi Tada. This is on? Yeah, Johanna Rodehannog, I'm also a CSAC postdoctoral fellow here. I had a methodological and more like a clarification question. The methodological question was if you could share more about the techniques for assessing information flow that you mentioned, because that sounded really interesting. What exactly are these and how do they work? And the second one, I think, was a clarification question regarding alternative explanations, but you might have, I'm not entirely sure whether you might have answered this already in the first long answer to Fahd, which is really just like essentially, like, for example, that Cooper quote that you projected, like, how is that, or like, how do we know that this is not explained by like psychology or like, you know, stuff like groupthink that you mentioned, or the conformity effect? I think you said something to the effect that we know it's the bureaucratic structure pushing Cooper to say that he agrees, but it didn't quite get why that was. If you could maybe clarify that. Thank you.
Sure. So I'll do the questions in reverse. I should probably modify that slide, because what he says right before that block quote, it's always a sort of balancing act, how much text you put on a slide versus not. Perhaps I need to modify this one. But what he says right before that is the reason why he felt like he needed to self-censor was because the decision had already been taken in an organizational venue to which he was not a party, right? So that's the thing that's informing there, at least in my read of the text. But yeah, I mean, I think in a broader sense, the way that I think about it is we certainly, in everyday life and in archival evidence, can see some group deliberations that tend to everyone all says the same thing, right? That could be groupthink, that could not be groupthink. And then we observe other settings in which it doesn't look at all that way, right? So Janus he was certainly onto something, but it's that variation between the outcomes, both of which occur in group settings, that this theory, I think, is pushing on. On your first question regarding measurement of information flow, it's a really sort of country-specific task, and it looks different for each one of the cases, right? So to take the leader chronicles, or the Niempu, that I coded as part of the data that I showed you for meeting, one of the things that I tried to do as part of that coding process is in some of the records, there is a indication of individuals supplying reports or briefings as part of the meeting on a particular topic, right? So that is an example of how we can see in archival evidence transmission of information, in this case, vertically. In more coordinating settings that Joanne Lai was chairing below the Politburo level or below the leader level, we can see similar things, which might get at horizontal. I showed you the one about the CC line. That's actually like peculiar to the Chinese case, just because, you know, the Chinese case, it's very difficult to study. Quantitatively in other country settings, so in the Indian records, I looked at a similar thing, but in the context of memos. So I tried to get access to the Prime Minister's daily records, who they had met with. That apparently is still held by the Ministry of External Affairs, their version of a foreign ministry, and is apparently still classified. So they said no. So, part of the process, right? Like I tried lots of things. A lot of times I was told no. So what I did was his personal papers, which I think actually Oriana was one of the very first scholars who got access to the post 47. I think she just left the room, so she missed my shout out. So the post 47 Nehru papers, which are housed in the Nehru Memorial Library in Delhi, contain the paper flow that made its way through the Prime Minister's office, or Prime Minister's Secretariat. I forget what it was called at the time. I think DMO. And so I cataloged that and tried to show there. I was just drawing a descriptive inference about the imbalance of information that was flowing up from the MEA relative to the Defense Ministry. So that was the Indian case. Oriana, you just missed the shout out I gave to you. I know. Yeah, in any case. And then for the US case, I mean, the US case is obviously like, there's so much you could do with the US case because the archival record is so rich. So for the interactions with advisors face-to-face, I did the same thing as I did with the Chinese records, but just with the presidential daily diary. And these are literally available, like you can go on your phone right now and download them all. They're typically housed at the websites of the different presidential libraries, but you can see, and I cataloged every day what Lyndon Johnson did, who he met with, and in this case, how long he met with. So if you look at the stats just the charts for the US case, it's number of hours, I think, as opposed to just the number of meetings as it is in the Chinese case. And then, so on top of all of this, I'm supplementing it with sort of recollections about information flow, because oftentimes folks will talk about this. One of the tremendous services that individuals' area studies did for us that I tried to capitalize upon in this book was, area studies has for a long time been interested in cataloging the organizational charts of countries and cataloging what happens or what is happening in a state at a given moment in time. And one of the kind of early ideas of the book was like, what if we could take that and look systematically across time and space? Yeah, so great questions.
Very good. So,
Long-winded answers.
so X and then Patrick.
I'll try to be briefer.
I'm X and pre-doctoral fellow at CSAC, and from the case study, it seems to me that you are actually dealing with like two-layer problem. So the first layer is whether leader has the ability to rely on their bureaucracy to determine whether the underlying security scare is real. The second layer of the problem is whether it's actually what's the effective response to a security crisis or scale if it's real, right? So based on the case study, I am very much convinced by the information layer of the argument. But regarding the second layer, I'm just wondering to what extent in the case study, the coercive or deterrence policy in the 62 case is comparable to the 69 case, right? Because I imagine like if China also take a preemptive military action against Taiwan, that could lead to a very similar military retaliation response that is counterproductive, similar to 69.
Yeah. Yeah, I see that as one of, maybe I misunderstood the question, but I understood that as one of the strengths of the case, because I saw in 69 a relatively clear path to a third Taiwan Straits crisis, right? So Mao had approved shelling of Jinmen Island in 54 and 58, right? And one could easily imagine some similar military action in 1962. So I do see them as kind of parallel in that way. It is worth mentioning that I like are distinct processes, and they could be governed by different institutional processes, right? Different inefficiencies. That's absolutely true. I don't find that to be the case, but it could be. And it is important to flag that the Chinese system in even in 1962, right? It is exploring different strategies that China could pursue. I wouldn't equate that level of information search on the strategic side with what is possible in, say, the United States in 1964, 65, right? Like there are limits to how far bureaucrats can search within a so to the extent that was part of your question as well, I think that's important to flag and be humble about.
I'm Patrick Hume. I'm also a postdoctoral fellow here at CSAC. So I don't know if this is an easy question or a hard question, but it's a kind of very practical question. Do you see in the contemporary American context, like today or the last few years, or, we just had this election thing, so you might have noticed, does your work point to any particular pathologies kind of in the current American institutional setup? And if so, do you have any recommendations of how one might go about changing that? Thank you.
The first question is easy to answer because it's explanatory. I can give you what the theory says about the answer to your second question, but you won't like the answer, I don't think. So the way the origins logic works, or the part of the theory that deals with the origins of institutional design, is a simple two-node decision tree in which leaders first evaluate whether or not they consider the bureaucracy a threat to their political survival or political agenda. And then a second node in which they think about whether or not the primary means of political survival is domestic or internationally focused. Those are obvious, both of those things are very stylized things, but conceptually, it's two key ideas. First, like, does the bureaucracy threaten me? And then the second is, to what extent do I need them? Let me sort of walk through how that works. So on the first side, right, so in the Trump case, it is clear, and I don't mean to be political about this, but it is clear that Trump came in with a certain level of antagonism about the bureaucracy, right? We can broaden that out to, it's not just about the bureaucracy, it's just sort of the foreign policy elite, perhaps. But that's there. One could see that perhaps rooted in personality, if one wants to take that route, Faude's route. One could see that in sort of incriminating evidence, right? Trump is being investigated by the bureaucracy at the time. One could see this as a very different set of political preferences, right? So Trump is kind of a more populist leader with a different vision of foreign policy, perhaps, than the bureaucratic elite. So all three of those things are sort of pushing into the high category, which means that integrated institutions don't look so good, right? That's the theory's first contention and at the first node. The second node, the question becomes, okay, so what are you going to do about it? And what the theory argues is that it depends upon what is it that you need in order to survive politically. Is this primarily a situation where you want to maximize for foreign policy success, perhaps because you're facing imminent military security threats? Or is this a context where, like, you want to transform domestic society? Think about those sort of like two ends of a spectrum and then lots of space in between. So it is, I would, and sorry, and to finish off the logic, the theory argues that when you're facing more of those international security threats, you opt into siloed because, and I don't go into this, I argue that siloed, even though they're worse than integrated, are sort of a middle space. They're not quite as bad as fragmented. And so you sort of accept a little bit of political risk by letting information flow vertically, but eliminate horizontal information flow, which is going to degrade the quality of the information, but curb the bureaucratic threat a little bit. If you're domestically focused, however, you really don't have any need, right? Because what the foreign policy bureaucracy, the national security bureaucracy, is providing you is advice that will help you on a foreign policy agenda. But if you only care about getting things done domestically, that value to you, there's no reason to accept any risk. And so that's where you get fragmented. And you see this in the context of, like, think about the succession crisis after starting in the mid 1960s in Mao Zedong, which eventually culminates in the Cultural Revolution, right? This is a transformation of the party that continues on through the the late 1970s, early 1980s, as the party is dramatically reshuffling its identity from one focused on kind of Mao's version of Marxist-Leninism into something that is much more capitalist, right? We see this in the context of the United States in Lyndon Johnson, right? Part of his domestic, like he even says in his interviews with George Kearns Goodwin, I had this window of opportunity in which the international environment seemed to massively attenuate and I could focus on my domestic programs. What did Lyndon Johnson say that he wanted most? Great society, civil rights. And, you know, he uses sort of some expletives to refer to the Vietnam War. He doesn't want to have to he doesn't want to have to deal with Vietnam. So that's the way the sort of logic works. And in the contemporary case, if one looks at the first Trump administration, there is a kind of logic you can potentially see. Trump comes in with facing a certain threat, but he has a lot of foreign policy problems. He has to pull out of the Middle East, or he wants to pull out of the Middle East. He has the whole trade war with China. And so there is evidence. And so the theory would predict a siloed institution. And there is some evidence, actually, that he got rid of things like deputies committee meetings, or at least, exactly. Yeah, exactly. What would the theory predict based upon what we think, like, Trump is talking about going forward, right? It seems like the second term is going to be much more focused on internal things, domestic politics, right? Like, it sort of depends upon how seriously we take some of the rhetoric about domestic political transformation, but that would predict fragmented institution, if that's true.
All right, good. I've got I'm going to take a prerogative and ask the next question, then Scott, and then we've got an online question, but after Lindsay. So I've got so many questions, and I'm gonna try to have self-control. So this really is a follow-on on Fod's question in a lot of ways. Is it the institutions, or is it leader trust in subordinates? So I mean, it's a funny, in the parts of political science that focus a lot on institutions, there's the relatively clear-cut cases like legislative process and statutory stuff. There's a little bit of statutory stuff in this domain, but there's a lot of leader discretion. And how do you distinguish between a case like the process or the institutions are the same, but the leader just doesn't listen to, or they're there, but I don't consult them because I think they're trying to overthrow me or something. Maybe that's not a distinction that you want to make. And then the one other question I'll ask is, you say some people argue that you should push the bureaucrats out. Who is this? I don't think that's, I'm not a Janus and groupthink expert, but I thought their kind of recommendations were don't have, smart bureaucrats and intelligence analysts, but rather have people, what do they call it? Arguing the opposite case and
Right, devil's advocates.
Devil's advocates and things like that. Are there actually people who say oh, you should make your decisions by yourself?
Right. Yeah. So these are both excellent questions. Leaders versus leaders not listening. So it's possible that a leader sitting at the top a perfectly well functioning integrated institution would still not listen. Of course, that's true. And that could either be because they doubt the information, or have other sources of information, or some sort of psychological bias that would make them resistant to updating based upon new information. The way I think about it is sort of, given all of those other constraints, both the massive amount of uncertainty that exists within the world, as well as perhaps cognitive impediments to updating, what institutions would tend to provide the conditions that would make leaders most likely to listen, right? So the kind of natural debate that I think emerges, or at least is more likely to emerge in situations in which you're forcing diplomats and defense officials to debate with one another, does give the leader a little bit more confidence, because if they're thinking strategically, if they think that there's less likelihood that the bureaucracy is providing biased information, beneficial information.
Put it differently. So if Mao says I'm just going to listen to the military and I'm not inviting the foreign ministry guys, how is that an institution? He could choose to have the foreign ministry there. He's a dictator. He's not constrained by a law that says you have to have them both at the table.
Yeah, no, certainly. So there's a distinction, I think, in terms of whether or not this is entirely at the leader's discretion, or whether or not the leader sets up rules and organizations that do that for them. So one could imagine, as you just said, that the leader at each moment in time literally decides who will be in the meeting. That's possible. That it doesn't just happen in Mao's China, it happens in the United States. What is more often the case, however, is that both through organizational appointments and through rules in which those organizations are used, the leader sort of sets up the way that will function going forward. So in the case of the foreign ministry in 1969, the reason the foreign ministry is not participating is, I suppose Mao could have overridden his choice, but it is in part based upon the fact that the foreign minister, Chen Yi at the time, has been sent down to a locomotive factory and not been replaced. So there's no one within the Politburo in the foreign ministry that has the status. There's a broader question, though, that I think the question begs about whether or not the political power to make these choices in and of itself makes any institutional appointments non-credible. So what do I mean by that? So let's say in the 1950s, Mao sets up his organizational chart to include the foreign ministry, right? I think what you're saying is because he has absolute power, the foreign ministry knows that that appointment can be revoked at any time, which could theoretically lead to the same sorts of pathologies that I'm saying. This is why I think like this theory can exist alongside, say, Jessica Weeks's argument, which is really about power, right? But this would modify Jessica's argument to the extent that even if Mao has absolute political power in the 1950s, it might be possible that he could, at the margins, shape things in ways that improve things for him. The second question, yeah. So I think, like, if you go back to Allison, there's both this kind of widespread notion that organizations tend to get things wrong, or bureaucracies tend to get things wrong, but then this there's this very explicit discussion about whether or not institutions can remedy things. And in the discussion, he points to Arrow and essentially says very explicitly that we're very skeptical that institutional design can improve performance. That reads, when I read that in graduate school, that read off to me because there's a host of literature in American and comparative that say, no, actually, there's a lot of things that leaders or institutions might do to improve efficiency. I'm not sure why he's coming to this conclusion. So that's part of what I'm sort of keen off of. With regard to Janice and it's actually George who comes up with the devil's advocate. Janice might have pulled from that. It's a 72 APSR article, which eventually becomes a 1980 book from George. George, of course, is thinking about George Ball in the Vietnam deliberations, which Johnson and Bundy explicitly use the term, we will perform a devil's advocate exercise. What Bob Jervis subsequently noted, and I, looking at the history, very much agree with them. The devil's advocate the prescription that we should have a devil's advocate actually is like really counterproductive. Why do I say that? Because it implies that you already have a fixed position, right? If we already know what direction we want to go, and we're just going to appoint one person to make the case that against it, it's not the same thing as an open discussion in which we're not queuing upon the specific policy at hand, but rather bureaucratic interests and perspectives and information to facilitate deliberation and dialogue prior to reaching some decision. Yeah.
Okay. All right, good. I've got Scott, and then I've got a question from Caleb online. And if you want to go on the list, send me a signal. Yeah.
That's Sagan from CSAC and the Political Science Department. Your theory is about the accuracy of intelligence or of estimates of what an adversary might do. Yet you measure the outcome of different bureaucratic structures by the success or failure of stage of crisis. And it seems to me that that you could have really accurate probabilistic estimates and then fail. We know that happens. Or you could have relatively poor estimates and fail. So when you're doing this, you see a difference between the success rate and the accuracy of intelligence or estimates rate, and how does that play out in the stories?
Yeah, it's 100% true. And what I glossed over in the case studies, that medium end approach, look, it's really hard to assess the quality of information in every crisis, even just across these 4 countries. In the IS article that came out in 2023, I do that for China. Nitty gritty, it's in like a 50-page single-space appendix where I went through every crisis and I tried to do it. In the other 3 case countries, India, Pakistan, and the United States, I relied upon what other people had written about the quality of assessments in each of the crises. Actually, dovetailing with Janice, so there's this JCR article from, I think, 1987, co-authored with Paul Huth, in which they had historians for the early Cold War code different informational pathologies for any one of the, so I do a kind of medium end analysis pulling on them. I haven't validated it the same way I have with China. But yeah, so and obviously it's mismatched. The question is, can we learn something, particularly in the cross-national statistical analysis, about crisis success and failure rates, thinking about them in relative terms. So here's what would have to be true for us to learn something from them, but I think is true. So if you buy my premise that leaders make these choices about initiating and not based upon a cost-benefit analysis, right? Crises and the initiation of them are risky propositions because they entail the threat of escalation and costs on the battlefield. They could pay off, but that's, there's some probability of it doing so. Theoretically speaking, and this also, sort of Jessica Weeks applies a similar logic, over time, if states have a relatively good assessment process that gives them good probability estimates about success and failure, over time, theoretically, those with more accurate assessment processes should be able to select out of crises that are not going to work out the way that they want. So certainly within any individual crisis, it's possible, and I tried to point to one in Mao's China, the first Taiwan Straits crisis in 1954, in which it doesn't work out exactly the same. Sorry, that was an example of just crisis failure under integrated institutions. There are other instances in which you either, just as you say, get good assessments and fail to get what you want, and vice versa. But if we think about those failure rates in relative terms, basically the proposition of the theory is that integrated relative to siloed and integrated relative to fragmented, if the selection story holds, should exhibit systematically different rates. Yeah.
Well, I admitted reading the article, but not the 50-page. I encourage you to do that.
Okay, Lindsay is next. You sure? Okay. All right, so I'm going to go to Caleb's question online, and then
Caleb
Pomeroy, yes.
Oh, hey, Caleb.
Caleb says, great talk, and then he's got more like praise.
We'll just gloss over.
Yeah, we'll jump over that, and let's see. Says in response to Fah's question, you essentially said that bureaucracies are the function of internal path dependence or leader personality, but could you instead say something about the second image reversed effects of the international environment on bureaucracies? Do the balance of power and threat shape bureaucratic structures? And because we have two more questions, either can you take that? Why don't we take the others, and then
Sure. Yeah.
So Harold.
Thanks. Really like to talk. To some extent,
to some extent, and maybe I missed this in your talk, and obviously I hadn't dug into the book. Is this a kind of a principal agent story where principal has to solve the problem of agent shirking? One way you do it classically is, you might have competing sources of information. The military diplomats is one way of solving things, sort of the fire alarm kind of theory of how you get accurate information from the agents. Versus, but another classic example from principal agent theory is a police patrol. You send out people to investigate, figure out who's right. And you kind of alluded to this in the EP3 incident, like how would they behave if they knew that the Ministry of State Security is investigating, all these different reports? And so do you see that in your story as another way in which leaders solve this problem? And I love the fact that you also have to worry about the agent threatening you, which adds a twist to your story, but that's my question.
Okay, and then Oriana.
Since I feel like I've been along for the ride with this project with you. So
I think you've seen like I think you've seen the version right after I defended my dissertation.
Yeah, I mean, I would go all the way back to when we were drinking in Beijing when you first started your field work. But that's how far I would go back to how long I've known about this project. But I just wanted to sort of build off the question that was previously asked about the Trump administration, but ask you one about Xi Jinping.
Yeah.
And in particular, kind of also in terms of methodology, how you conceptualize when you were thinking about bureaucracies and you did the silos and the fragmentation, and you might have touched upon this in the first few minutes of the talk when I wasn't here. The concept of centralization, right? There's a term that's used more in a colloquial sense, which I think is different than what you're referring to, because when I think about even the centralization of power, in one leader, that's not necessarily the bureaucracy, because maybe we would argue that the party right now, is more integrated than under Xi Jinping than fragmented. Anyway, I wanted you just to comment a little bit on how you see that, because there's a lot of the more public discussion about information flows and centralization in China. And then when you were thinking about this conception of bureaucracy, how much, do you think maybe it's a factor in how you coded it, but the changing size of bureaucracy? Because at least in the US case, right, one of the complaints, that would be made in the Department of Defense, which you probably heard, is, the expanding size of the NSC under Obama. So how does that play any role in our understanding of some of the effectiveness of bureaucracies? Because you're like, okay, push them out, and that's bad. But then as someone who works in these bureaucracies, like, yes, you did a lot of great research, but it's hard for me emotionally to accept that like more bureaucrats involved in this is better. So if you could just talk about those, those 2 points.
Yeah, so the last question is the easiest one because, and I don't know if you were here for the 2x2. If you look closely, the first dimension is leader information search capacity. And I toyed with the idea of broadening that to think about just information search capacity, in which case the variable then doesn't become the connective tissue between leaders and bureaucratic organizations, but rather, as you would say, as Barbara Geddes would sort of frame it, the capacity of the bureaucratic state in and of itself, right? So in this framework, right, I guess a strong person version of the argument would say, like, it doesn't matter how many people are in the defense ministry, so long as there's some formal and informal rules that allow the defense minister to get up to the leader. That's obviously not true and stylized, right? And I think a future area of research could look more directly at this question. I think actually though, and part of the reason I chose to do what I did conceptually, that the original first wave of literature on bureaucracy started where your head is at, right? It started with the big bureaucracy. If one thinks about Allison's third model, it's actually difficult to understand, well, does he think the leader is one of these things who are balancing against one another, or is he sitting atop, right? Or is the leader just not there altogether? If you look closely at Krasner's critique, his critique was sort of like the leader is absent here and actually they're on top. Krasner was right, I think, but what Krasner in the critique failed to, I think, really get at was that just because the leader's at the top doesn't mean that they're able to control what's going on below. And in the context of information search, doesn't mean that the information that's informing the way that they see the world, what Krasner was drawing attention to, is necessarily accurate.
So really, like, let's tighten them up a little bit.
Oh, sorry.
Come in under 5.
Yeah, okay. So we're going to dinner later so we can talk.
Okay.
Yeah. Harold's question. Yeah, so I don't put it in explicitly principal agent model terms. One could think about it. One could probably model it. I'm not a modeler, but I see the parallels. The police patrol thing is part of the story, actually, right? So if one thinks about the EP3 incident, the logic there is that give bureaucrats access, knowledge that the information is flowing up from the PLA, and allow them to see it. That allows them to contest it. They can say, do I agree with this? If I do, I can send a conflicting report or a disagreeing report. But if I don't see the information, if I don't even know the information is flowing up, then I might not even know the leader needs it. So it is part of a kind of police patrol type story. And then for Caleb's question, I mean, I'm tempted just to go with the praise, which I don't even really know what exactly it said, and just stop there. But the second image reverse, it seems, Caleb, and I'm going to kid you a little bit here, that you just sort of want me to put this in the context of your book. Which is very good. I don't know if you know Caleb's project. It's a really good project. You should all read it. But yeah, I mean, the way I would probably think about it is that it pushes on that second node of the decision tree, in which leaders are thinking about how much do I value foreign policy advice in situations in which the balance of power strongly puts some sort of instances in which countries think about themselves as highly insecure. They might prioritize the foreign policy aspects of that choice as opposed to the domestic ones.
Very good, terrific. Thanks very
Right
much.
on time, yeah.
Okay.